Furthermore, you are watching South Africa Now.
Global Vision presents the television news magazine of Southern Africa.
It doesn't exist on television, and it doesn't exist.
I would actually appeal to the world that information is there and can be found.
Because it is important that people know what is happening.
This week, South Africa Now presents these stories. Nelson Mandela in Lusaka. He meets his old comrades, greets congressional delegates, and receives a tumultuous welcome. And part two of our extended interview with Nelson Mandela. The interviewer, South African journalist Alistair Sparks.
We have ceased to think in terms of color. We think in terms purely of South Africans. And that has paid dividends because many people, including whites, they want to live in peace.
And in our culture segment, Ilonga, one of Zimbabwe's most popular bands. All of these stories and more this week on South Africa Now. But first, the uncensored news with hosts Fana Kekana and Carolyn Craven.
Dumelan, I'm Carolyn Craven. Sitting in for Fana Kekana is Phillip Tomlinson. This week, Nelson Mandela was officially named the Deputy President of the African National Congress during a series of meetings with the ANC National Executive Committee in Lusaka, Zambia. The decision-making body of the ANC announced plans to open their headquarters in South Africa and rebuild its organization. The committee met against a background of increasing speculation over the beginning of talks between the ANC and the government. South Africa's Weekly Mail reported that at least one ANC official, Thabo Mbeki, had had contact with South African officials. This could signal the beginning of talks, although the ANC has yet to name a delegation to meet with the South Africans. Phillip Tomlinson has our report.
After the happy celebrations at Lusaka Airport to welcome him to Zambia, Nelson Mandela received a U.S. congressional delegation led by Representative William Gray, head of the Congressional Black Caucus. The delegation heard Mandela insist that it is not yet time to lift sanctions against South Africa.
Because we believe that maintaining sanctions and even intensifying them is the best way of helping President Dan Quail in his attempt to open a new path in the history of this country.
The ANC also raised concerns about a reported trip to South Africa by U.S. Vice President Dan Quail.
It would not be correct for such a visit to be made at this point. It sends a different sort of message.
The congressional delegation responded by explaining that the U.S. sanctions law would not be lifted. Congressman Dellums, sponsor of the bill.
But I think that those persons in the Congress who have voted for sanctions understand that this is clearly not the time to be lifting sanctions. The law is very clear about the conditions that have to be met in order to lift sanctions. There are some of us that wanted to go even further, to continue to apply the pressure. And I heard there on more than one occasion here today in the hour that we spent with the ANC people that maybe that rather than this being a time to move away from sanctions, maybe it's time to even try to step up the pressure.
For Dellums, meeting Mandela was a moving experience.
It's a very emotional moment for me, very emotional moment. And when Nelson Mandela responded to me, I had to fight back the tears. And the feeling of camaraderie with brothers and sisters that I've only been able to talk about on the floor of Congress and suddenly come face to face with them in the context of Southern Africa. A very emotional feeling for me and very inspirational.
South Africa Now also spoke with other congressmen.
Our job is to find out how quickly change is going to take place. Will there be substantive change? And what are the political problems involved on all sides of the fence?
The principal message was the importance of maintaining pressure until it's absolutely clear that there's an irreversible process that will lead to democracy in South Africa.
For South Africa Now, this is Phillip Tomlinson reporting.
After the meetings in Zambia, Mandela traveled to Harare, Zimbabwe, where he campaigned for that country's president, Robert Mugabe, and his ruling Zimbabwe African National Union Patriotic Front, which faces a general election on March 28th and 29th. Mandela then spoke with leading South African businessmen. The discussion centered around the future economic climate of South Africa.
The 343 hunger strikers on Robben Island have been joined by other prisoners and those on trial in Johannesburg, Pretoria, Cape Town, and Kroonstad in the Orange Free State. The strikers are demanding unconditional release and the lifting of the state of emergency. Inside the country, solidarity action has been mounting with daily pickets and vigils. Relatives of the strikers have chained themselves outside the parliament in Cape Town. As of March 5th, one of the hunger strikers has been hospitalized and 73 supporters have been arrested.
Chief Gacha Buthelezi, leader of the Inkatha movement, a Zulu-based group engaged in an armed conflict with pro-ANC forces in Natal province, was traveling in the United States this week. He met with President Bush and Secretary of State James Baker to reiterate his call for the lifting of economic sanctions against South Africa. He will then travel to London, where he is scheduled to meet with British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Next week, we'll bring you our interview with Chief Buthelezi.
The army has taken power in the so-called independent homeland of Ciskei, deposing President for life Lennox Sebe. The bloodless coup was led by Brigadier Oupa Gqozo on March 3rd. In the news conference in Bisho, the capital, Gqozo condemned the deposed government for widespread corruption, detention of citizens, use of violence, and deteriorating health and education services. According to press reports, news of the coup was greeted by thousands of cheering residents, shouting, "Viva ANC!"
I'm Joseph Diescho with Namibia Watch. The U.S. State Department has indicated that either Secretary of State James Baker or Vice President Dan Quail will lead a delegation to Namibia for independence celebrations and the inauguration of the country's first president, Sam Nujoma. Sources say the visit is aimed at underlining the prestige Washington gained for the accord that led to Namibia's independence. This comes at a time when Namibia seems to be getting its foreign policy agenda on the road, with Canadian Secretary of State Joe Clark's meeting with Namibian officials and President-elect Sam Nujoma's recent visit to West Africa. Namibia is now counting the days to independence, scheduled for March 21st. Meanwhile, Anton Lubowski, the most senior white official of SWAPO, the Southwest Africa People's Organization, was assassinated on September 12th of last year. In January, a Johannesburg police investigator alleged that a military intelligence unit was responsible for Lubowski's murder, an allegation corroborated by disclosures in the Johannesburg Star. On February 26, South African Defense Minister Magnus Malan made the explosive claim that Lubowski was a spy for the South African military. This claim has been denounced by SWAPO and by Lubowski's family and close friends as groundless.
Lubowski was in New York in September 1988, and he gave South Africa Now this exclusive interview.
In 1984, I decided to join SWAPO openly, and since then I've been in detention 6 times. I've been 2 assassination attempts, and a lot of sort of threatening calls and threats made to my life.
Last week we spoke with Michaela Clayton, a South African human rights lawyer working in Namibia and a close friend of Lubowski's.
You know, Anton was a really dedicated and very highly principled man, and he spent his entire life fighting for the liberation of Namibia and for the liberation of the Namibian people. That was his entire life, and you know, to make allegations like this after he's been killed is just absolutely absurd.
We also spoke with Lubowski's father, Wilfred Lubowski, in Cape Town.
I consider it a blatant lie for the simple reason I cannot imagine how my son could ever act for people he hated with all his life. We are going to take legal action as soon as we can get hold of Malan's public statement. Once he's made this statement public, I go for his throat. We will not sit tight and let things go by. I can assure you we will fight him to
Whatever the truth, the death squad scandal, first implicating the police and now the military, is rocking the ruling government to its very core. To date, the military has yet to come forward with anything to substantiate Malan's claim. Jack Poe first broke the story on the existence of the death squads within the police.
He's made very funny allegations over the years. He's lied about South Africa's involvement in Angola. He's lied about various military operations in Namibia. So I don't know how serious people are taking Malan's allegation. I know that the Democratic Party in South Africa has accused Malan of lying, and I don't think many people believe him. I don't think there's any substance in his allegation.
As the controversy escalates, the one-person commission of inquiry appointed by President de Klerk starts work this week. Next week, we will have an interview with Captain Dirk Coetzee, the first policeman to admit to have worked for the police death squad.
South Africa Now produced for the Phil Donahue Show a satellite interview with Nelson Mandela from Lusaka, Zambia. This was the first opportunity for a U.S. audience to speak directly with Mr. Mandela. Here is an excerpt from that broadcast.
Do you favor the policy for complete divestment, or do you think it does more harm to the people than the government?
No. We are in favor of total sanctions. And if there is any suffering on our part, that is a price we are prepared to pay.
You're watching South Africa Now, the television news magazine that goes behind the headlines.
And now we bring you part 2 of our special extended interview with Nelson Mandela. The interviewer, Alistair Sparks, one of the most respected South African journalists.
You, like many of your fellow prisoners, seem to have come out of that long and bitter experience with very little bitterness in your hearts. How is that?
Well, it is not easy to remain bitter if one is busy with constructive and positive activities and attitudes. And we were able to organize our activities in such a way that we concentrated on things that were likely to improve our ability to educate ourselves, get information, and to plan your future. And it was not, we did not dwell, not concentrate on the harsh experiences that we had. And we also exercised quite an influence on warders because quite early during our imprisonment, we discovered that a section warder could be more important than the Commissioner of Prisons, and even more important than the Minister of Justice himself. As I have often said, if you go to the Commissioner of Prisons and you say to him, look, I want 4 blankets, he will take the regulations and look at them and says, no, in terms of the regulations, you can only have 3 blankets. But if you approach the section warder, he just goes to the storeroom and gives you an extra blanket. So we learned right from the beginning in order to cultivate our relations with warders.
One of these warders, Warrant Officer Gregory, actually followed you all the way through all your various transfers to other prisons right up till the moment of your release. That's an extraordinary relationship. Would you call it a friendship that has developed?
Certainly. We became great friends. And apart from the fact that he is a warder and he is required to carry out unpopular and even repressive policies, he as a man is a gentleman, and it was easy to get on with him, and I regard him as a friend.
Now, to some extent, this really typifies the ANC's policy. Your policy is one of non-racialism. You have a vision of a non-racialist future. One would have thought that given the apartheid experience, it would actually have been easier to mobilize your people on the basis of a counter-racism. But But you haven't done that.
The concept of non-racialism, as advocated by the ANC, is clearly set out in the Freedom Charter, which we published in 1955. I have pointed out before that that document is the most devastating attack on all forms of racialism. We have ceased to think in terms of color. We think in terms purely of South Africans. And that has paid dividends because many people, including whites, they want to live in peace. They want to live in peace with their fellow South Africans.
After all that has been done to you, Mr. Mandela, in and out of prison, and that has been done to your family, have you never had a moment where you have felt hatred towards whites?
Not against whites, and not even against the police force, which is responsible for the carrying out, for the execution of government policy, which, as I say, we regard as repressive. I have been angered when my family has been harassed, subjected to harassment. I have been angered, especially against the policemen who actually carried out this harassment. But this is a temporary feeling, and I soon forget it, because the central thing is to change the policy. And we are not really concerned with the individuals that carry out that policy. We draw a clear distinction between the policy that we oppose, that we resist, and the individuals who carry out that policy, because some of them have been good men, but they have been bad men. And when they attack your wife, your family, you can't rejoice over that. To that extent, I have been angry against certain individuals, but never against whites as such.
Now, you have described President de Klerk as a man of integrity in your judgment. What do you think he's really aiming at?
However good he may be, he represents the National Party. And the National Party today is still an apartheid party. And there are many racial laws which are still operating. And that is what decides us. So that our strategies are going to be based on the fact that apartheid is still intact.
Now, there is also a considerable right-wing reaction among whites against what President de Klerk has done. I went over to Pretoria the other evening and saw a very frightening rally of about 50,000 people displaying Nazi flags. They were hanging you in effigy and swearing to resist bitterly. And one was left wondering whether this is an assimilable element.
As far as absorbing them into the struggle for a non-racial South Africa, I don't think that is possible. These are people who are trying to get into power by exploiting racialism, pure racialism. And the National Party has tried this over 40 years, and it has had to abandon it. 75% of the whites in the country have clearly indicated their preference for change. And to that extent, I think that we must not waste our energy by thinking that we can absorb the right wing into the mainstream of politics in this country, which is for a non-racial society. What is more is that if Mr. de Klerk stops thinking of the Afrikaners as such and working out solutions on the basis of pleasing the Afrikaners, if he stops that and think in terms of all the people of South Africa, including blacks, then he will be in an invincible position. And any weaknesses in his armament, political armament, is due to the fact that despite the fact that he's a man of integrity, which I fully accept. However, the fact that he thinks in terms of Afrikaners or the most of whites is a serious mistake.
Now, Mr. Mandela, your movement, the ANC, has committed itself to multi-party democracy. It's committed to non-racialism, and it's committed to having a mixed economy. The one thing that puzzles people in the West, particularly at this time, is its alliance with the South African Communist Party and its commitment to some major nationalization. Why people are confused by this is that it happens at a time, or your reaffirmations of these points happen at a time when we have seen Eastern Europe undergo a major popular revolution against communism.
The international community has no right to be worried about the alliance between the ANC and the Communist Party of South Africa. After all, the West has itself worked together with communist countries in solving international problems. And the classic example is the alliance between Britain, America, France, and the Soviet Union. During the last World War, the alliance to defeat Hitler and to make sure for the world that they will never again be faced with the evil of Nazism. I attach no importance whatsoever on the anxiety, the concern of the West about our alliance. That alliance is necessitated by the common problem of racialism that we have in this country. And we have no intention whatsoever of reviewing our stand in this regard. As far as the question of nationalization is concerned, you will notice from the Freedom Charter that we have declared in favor of nationalizing the mines, the financial institutions, and monopoly industry. This is the only sector in which we intend to nationalize. The rest of the economy remains intact. The rest of the economy is based on private enterprise. It is a market economy, and we have no intention whatsoever of interfering with that. It is strange to us that there should be any concern whatsoever on the principle of nationalization when sectors of the economy now are nationalized. As far as your reference to what is happening in Eastern Europe, President Gorbachev has had the courage and the honesty to stand up and confess to the entire world that the system of government to which he has committed his life has serious deficiencies. I have to see a comparative leader in the West who will stand up and confess to the world that the system of imperialism and colonialism, which brought so much hardship to the people of the world, was a mistake.
Madela, thank you very much. Thank you.
You're watching South Africa Now. Coming up next, our culture segment, featuring the best music, film, drama, and artistic expression from Southern Africa.
And now, the U.S. premiere of a video by one of Zimbabwe's most popular bands, Ilanga. They shared the stage with Bruce Springsteen, Tracy Chapman, and some of the biggest names in rock during Amnesty International Human Rights Now tour of 1988. We are pleased to present this video produced by Zimbabweans in Zimbabwe.
Who shall save the human race?
Who shall preserve creation? Who shall save the human race? Who shall preserve creation? People are killing one another because of money. The root of all this evil. And yet destruction of the poor is poverty. For silver and gold, for silver and gold. You know you take money. For silver and gold, for silver and gold. I know how much you tell me now you show jalo.
That's our program this week. We are grateful to our viewers who continue to respond to our financial crisis. Thank you for joining us. On behalf of everyone at South Africa Now, I'm Carolyn Craven. See you next week.
Nelson Mandela, Free at Last, a South Africa Now PBS special, is available on home video for $14.95. Send check or money order to South Africa Now, 361 West Broadway, New York, New York 10013. South Africa Now is produced by Global Vision on a non-profit basis in association with the Africa Fund, a tax-exempt organization providing assistance and relief to victims of apartheid.